Good afternoon. Let's get settled. We have a busy afternoon session, starting with 2 lightning talks. Then we have 2 regular talks and then a panel, which will then be followed by a BOF and then a social. And everything is back to back. So let's get the coffee, sit down, and I will call for our first presenter, Sandra Brown. She will be talking on an IPv4 transaction.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Sandra Brown from the IPv4 Market Group, and before I forget, I have a few flyers on the topic I'm going to speak to, so if anybody wants to come and get one from me after I speak, feel free to grab me either right after the presentations or anytime you see me in the hallway. I have to admit, I'm feeling a little bit like the odd person here because all I hear is, have you put IPv6 on something today, or are you ready for IPv6? And I'm talking to you about, here's where you can get some IPv4 addresses, so I'm a little bit different. What I'm going to talk about is the IPv4 transfer process, how to obtain more IPv4 addresses. So I guess, first of all, if you don't feel the need for IPv4 addresses, you can probably tune me out. If you have excess IPv4 addresses, you probably want to listen because I'll tell you how you can monetize them. So I think that's probably a good intro. I thought what I'd do is start off by showing some interesting statistics on where the IPv4 addresses are, and why, in my opinion at least, RIPE needs an Inter-RIR transfer policy. And this slide clearly shows that in the IRIN region, they hold the highest concentration of IPv4 addresses per capita at almost 5. And you can see this compares to about 0.8 in the RIPE region. And the rest of the world trails dramatically from these two. This slide shows that in response to the question, why do we need transfer policies, the simple answer, and it's because the RIRs have run out. As you probably know, in February of 2011, IANA allocated the last of the 5/8s to the regional RIRs, including RIPE, and RIPE's down to its /8, and the last I read, it's projected to be out this summer. I heard August, but there's probably people in this room that know far better than I what the exact date will be. I think the point is that once RIPE runs out, where are you going to get the IPv4 when you need it? And with only 0.8 IPs per user in the RIPE region and 5 IPs per user in North America, many of which are dormant, by the way, it makes sense to allow transfers from the IRIN region and between regions. So what is the current RIPE transfer policy? And as you may know, I'm one of the people working to update the RIPE transfer policies. And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, beginning with proposal 2012-01, we have an Inter-RIR transfer policy that I'm going to speak to tomorrow morning, and a couple other people are going to join me. And the current intra, with an RA, RIR transfer policy, it's documented in section 5.5 of the RIPE IPv4 address policy. And the core pieces of this policy are that the recipient must demonstrate need, and you can't reallocate the blocks to another LIR for a 24-month period. And most importantly, the transferred blocks are treated no differently than a block assigned directly by RIPE. So I think that's an important point. And I think it's something we need to talk about within RIPE in the future. Because when a company pays for a block, and that's what's going to happen when you do a transfer, when a company pays for a block and you don't obtain it for free anymore, the company might like it to be treated a little differently. So that's not the point of my talk, but I just want to mention that point. And the next slide is the core of my presentation, and it's the steps to a successful IPv4 transfer. So first, for whatever reason, the transactions are usually under a non-disclosure agreement. I think that sellers don't like it to be known that they're selling their IPs. I've seen some of the companies are under financial trouble, the early companies doing it, and buyers don't like it to be known that they're buying. They don't want other companies to come up and start buying too and push the prices up. So you see a lot of NDAs. I think it's a scarce resource, and therefore there's a lot of secrecy around it right now. And I know that makes people nervous, because then people say, well, it should be more open, because I know there's a lot of openness in the internet world. But the reality is that people tend to be very closed about it, and I think that's just because they want it to be kept quiet. After you're under NDA, the buyer receives information so that you can see the chain of custody and feel comfortable that the block is registered to who they say it's registered to, and also that it's not blacklisted. Then the buyer prepares an offer, usually at the price they're prepared to pay, and the offer may be verbal, but often is formally presented in a document called an asset purchase agreement. And in the APA, the asset purchase agreement, you also document other negotiation points. It could be something like, when do you want the transaction to close? What are the payment terms? Will there be a deposit? How the transaction will be taken through the RIRs, and how the transaction will be registered to what company, and so on. So IPv4 Market Group, we require all our transactions to go through escrow, and that's for the safety of all the parties involved. The buyer deposits the funds in the escrow at the beginning of the transaction, and then upon close, the funds are released to the seller. This guarantees that the funds are available, and it also ensures that the funds are released only if the IPs are correctly transferred and usable. All the IRRs we deal with currently have a needs justification step, and that means ARIN, APNIC, and RIPE. The seller is required to provide an affidavit to declare that the block is being transferred to the buyer. And after all this administrivia, then the registry transfer happens. So we've done lots of intra within the RIR transfers within North America. It's quite straightforward. And for an inter-RIR transfer, I'm told they're going to mimic the ERX transfer process, where the sending registry points to the receiving registry. The IPs are then routed and announced by the ISP of the receiving company. Lastly, the funds are released from escrow and the seller is paid. So my final point, I thought that you'd be interested just in prices a little bit. I can say that this is a view of U.S. pricing only, since we've done transactions in the U.S. and a couple in Asia. And I think the demand equation may flip when you start to see inter-RIR transfers. So we'll see. I just want to mention too that this Nortel Microsoft transaction is kind of personal for me. My history in the business was that I worked at Nortel for 15 years, and I orchestrated and led the project at Nortel that brought about this first transaction. So that's how I came to be in this business. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Right. Any questions for Sandra? This is not controversial at all anymore? Okay, there you go.
Hello. Ooh. Dania Karenberg, RIPE NCC. I've been waiting for 10 years for this kind of presentation here. I'm actually quite happy that it only happens now, that we're almost run out of the unallocated pool. My question, what kind of databases and other information are you usually using when finding out, I don't quite recall how you call it, whether a block is good in the sense of usable, and whether the seller actually has the title to it, if we can call it title, and how important are the RIR registries in that process?
For us?
For you, yes, for you, and of course, since you are sort of a matchmaker also for the seller and the buyer.
Okay, so for us, the RIR registries are very important. We look at how the block was initially registered in the RIR. If the company which currently claims to hold the block does not still exist, or there's a downstream company holding the block, then we go through what we call the chain of custody, and we do a lot of legal research through the court system, the merger and acquisition system, looking at certificates of merger acquisition and so on.
Okay. And what other sources are you using sort of to make it, to check the bona fides and the usability of the address block, or is that for the buyer to do?
No, it's not for the buyer to do. It's for the seller to prove. And as a broker with a seller under contract, we work with each seller individually, depending on the circumstances, to be able to prove certifiably that they're the owner. And we've had a situation where the seller claimed something and they weren't able to prove, and we walked away from them.
Okay. And other than title, you mentioned blacklists and things like that. How are you doing that?
Sorry, what was the word?
Blacklists and stuff.
Oh.
Other than title, I mean usability. That's what I'm getting at.
Usability, to say if it's on a blacklist.
On a blacklist, on routable, and all that.
Yeah, for blacklisting, you can do scans.
Okay. Thank you.
Before the next question, can I just mention that we are really running out of time, so I will just close the queues for the mic with 3 people here. Thank you. So I believe Paul is next. Yeah.
Thanks, Phyllis. Thanks, Sandra. It's Paul Wilson, head of APNIC. I don't so much have a question as a bit of information that I'd like to provide to the audience here from APNIC's point of view on transfers, if that's all right, Phyllis. We ran out of our conventional supply of V4 for infrastructure space just over a year ago. The anniversary was the day before yesterday. So over the last year, we've have been gearing up towards more and more transfers, and having just come to this meeting from China, which is still booming in a way you wouldn't believe, I can see a lot more activity coming up. So I think it's a very timely presentation here. There are 2 things that we've done at APNIC over the last year in preparing for an increase in transfer activity. The first of those is actually about the request process, because we did change our IPv6 transfer policy to require demonstrated need to be fulfilled before a transfer could be approved. But looking at the timing aspect, this is something you interestingly didn't touch on here, Sandra, is that the request process can actually be a long process, and it's an indeterminate process, and we have expected that people with addresses to sell would not want to be committed to a particular buyer who then had to go through a long justification process.